to hear. If you can just, type okay or let me know that you're able to hear. And thank you, Natalie, the real Natalie, for recording today's meeting. Excellent. It seems like our sound is working. So Diane may be having difficulty sharing the screen. So Morgan, if you are ready, I will go ahead and share the screen and mute my mic. And then Morgan, you can begin presenting.
Great. Can everyone hear me now? Yes, good. I love the chat box. Thank you so much for having us today. Diane and I have worked together on several issues, and we're really excited to talk about our work today. I'm really excited to be able to talk about implicit bias, particularly in how it impacts young children and how young children are disciplined in schools. And I know that you all do have some background on implicit bias, so some of this you're already familiar with, but I'll start off just kind of giving an overview of what's going on in the school to prison world and how implicit bias plays into that. And then Diane will be able to talk about a report that Texans Care for Children actually just put out this week, which is awesome, and some of her work. So let's get started. And if along the way you guys have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat box and we will work hard to catch them and answer them in a timely fashion. It looks like it's loading. And while we're waiting for it to load, if those of you who are able to type into the chat box, could you just let Diane and I know the type of work that you do and how you are, oh, there it is, the type of work that you do and how you work with or support young children. That would be great to just have a sense of all of you. So we have home-based parenting education. That's awesome. ECI assistant program director, director of early childhood program, early childhood intervention. So all of you could probably be giving this presentation, which is awesome. Glad to hear that there's so many people who this is just right up their alley. Parent educator coordinator with Aspire, Communities and Schools of Central Texas. Great. We'll let a few more come up, and I think we can just go to the next slide. I don't know now who is controlling it, Diane or Marcy, but oh, there we go. Parent educator. Ooh, so many parent educators. This is great. Thank you all. It's so nice to know how it is that you're working with children, and hopefully I'm sure this is all something that you are all familiar with, but hopefully we can give you some new information. And again, please feel free to ask questions as they pop up. So I work on school to prison pipeline issues. So I thought I would just give an overview of what that is and what some of the data here in Texas looks like right now. So essentially, what it looks like even for very, very young students who are in early childhood programs or in preschool, pre-K programs, is that it really is based on a lack of supports and not using evidence-based methods to support children who need additional supports if they have something going on in their lives, or to just give basic support to children who are doing completely developmentally appropriate behaviors. And instead, what we see is that schools are using exclusionary discipline, so putting young children into ISS or OSS, and for a little bit older children, putting them into alternative schools or even expelling kids from school. And for some kids, we even see the criminalization of children with police and school to court contact. And as a result, what's very obvious, I'm sure, to all of you, is that there are some negative consequences. So there are some immediate short-term consequences. They miss classroom time, They miss socialization time. They're not with their teachers and peers. They begin to develop thoughts that they are a bad kid that no one wants to spend time on. Instead, they just get put out. Their peers see that. Teachers begin to see that and pass that along to the next teacher, and students can really become disengaged. And that really makes sense. If someone is constantly punishing you for something that you can't even understand what it is that you're being punished for, that can become very, very frustrating for a young child. And in the end, the whole pipeline part of the school to prison pipeline is that we know now from decades of research and data collection that what this approach to young people can lead to is grade retention, dropout, contact with the justice system, poor academic outcomes, and all sorts of collateral consequences that go along with those outcomes. Next slide, please. So, as I just mentioned, there's actually quite a bit of research about what this means concretely for students, and particularly young children. So we know that young students who are expelled or suspended are as much as 10 times more likely to drop out of high school, experience academic failure and grade retention, hold negative school attitudes, and face incarceration than those who are not. And this comes from the Department of Health of Education and the Department of Health and Human Services, which issued a position paper on the use of suspensions and expulsions in early childhood education settings. Next slide. Thank you. And so I think one interesting thing that to consider, and something that people always ask me when I talk about exclusions for very young children, is what could a 4-year-old possibly do to get pushed out of class? It's a little bit incredible when they are incredulous when they hear it. And so when kids get pushed out, a lot of times, if there is a student code of conduct, it's for some very vague violation of that code. And so what we saw, for example, is that lots of codes of conduct will have violation or offenses like horseplay, and class disruption and dress code violations. And again, these are very vague. They are up to the adult in the classroom who is observing the behavior to determine. And often horseplay or doing something that seems disruptive is actually a behavior that's completely developmentally appropriate for a young child, or it's something that may signal that there's something going on in the child's life where they need some extra support. Next slide, please. And so Diana and I, throughout the presentation, have a couple of polling questions that we're hoping that everyone will sort of weigh in on in the chat box. And this is the first. What are some examples of age-appropriate behaviors for a 3-year-old that all of you have, either observed or just know that this is what 3-year-olds do? If you could just take a minute or two to put those in the chat box. Biting, great one. Obviously very common and could signal all sorts of things, including like interest and love and just, testing out what's going on physically. Short attention span, hitting, jumping, running, physical movement, tantrums, emotions. Yeah, emotions. God, they're people. They're just learning, and they have all sorts of emotions that they're learning about. Yelling, running, jumping, yelling, not sharing, pushing to get one's way. So these are great because they're right on target. Like we all have met a 3-year-old, a 4-year-old, a 5-year-old. And so this is what happens. They cry, they have emotions, they yell, they hit, they bite. They also bring a lot of really, really wonderful qualities to the classroom environment. But these are really age appropriate behaviors. But if you think about, what was on the previous slide and the types of behavior that get punished, so horseplay or classroom disruption, these could all fall under those categories. And again, depending on the adult that's in the room that's interpreting the behavior, they could easily categorize any of these appropriate behaviors as something that should be punished instead of something that, just needs, energy that needs to be redirected, or a child who's in need of some lesson on how to interpret and respond to their emotions. And so it's really a system of punishment that, in many cases punishes children for just being themselves, and doing what they're supposed to do, or again, in some cases, might be punishing children for something that's beyond their control that needs to be addressed in a deeper way. Thank you for those, everyone. Next slide, please. And so we wanted to share some Texas data. This comes from a report that we published called Suspended Childhood, where we analyzed the use of exclusionary discipline for pre-K and elementary school students. And we found that there are actually a shocking number of out-of-school suspensions for elementary school students. We also found that Black students are overrepresented. This is the graph on the right is kindergarten through second grade, and we see that Black students are the only group that is overrepresented. Children with special education needs are also overrepresented. And so we'll get into the part about implicit bias, but just to give you, what's happening, a sense of what the data looks like, that this is really, really happening to young children. Should I share my screen? Yeah, those numbers are astounding, Terry. Am I the only one that's getting the presentation went away on my screen? Is that happening for everybody else? I just want to make sure. Okay, thank you. Okay, so while that's getting fixed, I can just kind of continue to talk through what this looks like. So yeah, the numbers are really astounding. And okay, thanks, Diane. The numbers are really astounding. And if you, here we go. And if you dig down into just the race data, and this is for exclusions generally, across the country, we know that Black preschoolers are more than 3.5 times more likely than their peers to be suspended. I just find this so appalling. In Austin ISD, which is the school district that my 4-year-old is in, Black kindergartners were 7% of the population, but 50% of out of school suspensions, which is insane. And Austin, I will say that there has since this data been a change in the state law. So now pre-K through second grade students cannot be suspended out of school anymore, except for 4 circumstances: drugs, alcohol, assault, which we're concerned about. What did I say? Drugs, alcohol, assault, and weapons. And so Houston ISD, Austin ISD, Dallas, and El Paso passed bans before the state law. And part of it was in response to just this terrible data, not only that these very young children were being suspended, no matter who they were, but that Black children and students with special education needs were just significantly overrepresented. And we also know that this is not focused on young students, but we also know that Latino students are often overrepresented, particularly in alternative school placements. Next slide, please. And so, part of what we are doing here today, and the thing that is asked all the time, is why does this happen? Why are certain students, and again, this slide is about students of all ages, but kids with special education needs, Latino children, Black students across the board, no matter the punishment, no matter the interaction with school police, are always overrepresented. Young students, boys are generally overrepresented, but when you look and you break it down by intersections, we see that Black girls are suspended more than most boys, except for Black boys. And then we know that LGBTQ cute youth we know anecdotally that they experience the school discipline system differently than their peers do. So why is this happening? Next slide, please. So you all have already gotten a very wonderful presentation from Marcy on implicit bias, but just to go over it and to take any questions that maybe you still have that are lingering, what can explain some of this is implicit bias. I want to be clear that it is also institutional, structural, systemic racism that has set up systems that impact the way that kids are educated, that impact where they live, that impact their access to all sorts of services, including health care, healthy food, that also contribute to what is going on in schools. But just to focus on one component of it, implicit bias and what happens in individual classrooms and how teachers view behaviors of different students differently. And so, as you all know, implicit bias refers to the stereotypes that affect our understanding actions and decisions in an unconscious manner. So there's what you know you can consciously say that you would do, but there's this other side of your brain that sort of acts in an unconscious way, automatic way, and you might respond to certain people or situations differently than what your active thinking brain would maybe tell you would do. Next slide, please. So we know that Terry, I totally agree with you, and I am happy to talk with you offline about why I chose those symbols and kind of what I thought they would evoke for people. Um, so implicit bias in education, there's been a lot of work on this issue and more going on, fortunately, about the impacts that people's biases have on the way that they view students. So we know that teachers' assumptions about students based on race have an impact on their expectations for students, what they think that they will what they think they will be able to achieve academically, on their perceptions of aggression and how they view student behavior. We even know that colorism comes into play in implicit bias. So darker skinned Black girls are more likely to receive punishments and harsher punishments than fair skinned Black girls. And we also know that there's information out about generally what is called the Black escalation effect. So when teachers view the discipline records of the study had teachers view the discipline records of children with traditionally white names and children with like sort of stereotypically Black names. And even though they had very similar discipline records, when the teachers viewed the records of students with stereotypically Black names, they were more likely to recommend punishments and harsher punishments. So where another student might be, sent to the principal's office for an hour to cool off, for a Black student, it would be out of school suspension. So that's the escalation. Next slide, please. So I was hoping my GIF would work, but it's not. There's a study that I love. For those of you that don't know and have never seen me put up this slide before, Drake dances across the screen. This is from the Hotline Bling video, and I love it so much. And it is to illustrate in an extreme way a study that was done that had teachers interpret the academic, abilities and need for discipline for students with a stereotypically Black walking style. So the only thing that teachers viewing the videos knew about the child is that they walked with this Black walking style, which was like head slightly tilted to the side, slight knee bend, a strut. And so when they saw the videos of children with this walking style, they assumed that the children were more in need of special education services, that they would not succeed academically, and that they would likely need some sort of exclusionary discipline like a suspension. This is simply based on the way that a child walks. So if you think about all of the other things that a teacher could be viewing: a child, who brings the child to class, how a child's dressed, how a child walks, what a child sounds like, and all of the assumptions, the terrible assumptions that can be triggered from those small things. It really gives you a sense of how all of this could add up and lead to these implicit biases playing out in the school discipline system. And kids who are otherwise like right on track and wonderful and smart and joyful as children are, have these assumptions placed on them just simply for what they look like. Um, so I unfortunately cannot access, this is Judy in response to your question, access my notes looking at this screen, but I will happily share all of these studies with Marcy to pass along to all of you so you can look more at them. The next slide, please. I know you guys reviewed this study with Marcy. This is the study out of Yale that tracked the eye movements of teachers and asked them to watch a video of students playing in a preschool class. And when they tracked the eye movements of these teachers and asked them to look for which students were misbehaving, even though no student actually was, the teachers were more likely to watch black boys for misbehavior. And of course, when they're watching the black boys, that's when they find the misbehavior. So it's just a way that implicit bias is playing out, and we can see that when people are primed to think that something wrong is happening, and then they look for the black people to do it. That's who they're going to end up punishing, and even applies to punishments for very, very young students. Next slide, please.
Diane, are you on? Diane, are you?
I think while the screen is getting back up, if anyone has any questions about what we've talked about so far, or implicit bias, or any changes in the law around exclusions for young people, I'd be happy to answer them while we're getting our technical stuff worked out.
I'm able to continue to share my screen, but we're not getting audio from Diane.
I just saw her typing. No, Diane, we can't hear you.
Try. Morgan, if you could mute your mic. Diane, if you can try and enable your mic again. I noticed you had logged in twice, and now I have both of the logins as a presenter. That should be able to get you to pull up. Diane, we still Okay, we are having some difficulty here. Um, we are not able to hear Diane, even though we have her as a presenter. And I think she's trying to make sure she gets her mic enabled. I know that we had this working before. I can go ahead and share the screens again so that we can begin to look through some of Diane's slides. And then Diane, I'm hoping, yes, we can. Excellent.
Yay. I am so sorry. Technical difficulties here.
That is okay. I'm going to mute my mic and then I will control the slides for you.
Thank you. Okay, so this is Diane Ewing. I'm with Texans Care for Children. I'm the Mental Health Policy Fellow. And so in going through these slides, what I'd like to do, and thank you, Morgan, for your information and your slides. I certainly learned a lot as well. And so I will be kind of telling a story through a timeline, and I will switch between information that concerns public school and also information that is pertinent to childcare. So I will kind of let you know which area of education I am speaking to. So in 2014, and Morgan had a wonderful quote from the policy statement from the Department of Health and Human Services and the Department of Education. And so this policy statement, if you think about it, Walter Gilliam's research was published in 2005. That is the research that shows that preschoolers are expelled at 3 times the rate of K through 12 students. So what ends up happening is 9 years later, after that research came out, is when this policy statement was set. And what it does is it raises awareness about expulsion and suspension in early child care and sends out guidance that disciplinary policies need to be free of bias and discrimination, and that systems need to use data. But the problem with that is that Texas does not collect data on the use of suspensions and expulsions in childcare. We do know discipline data in public school. Schools need to submit their discipline data to the Texas Education Agency, and therefore we're able to see that there is disproportionate use on Black children, boys, students in special education, and what we found was also in students who are in the foster care system. So if you would like to create steps and goals to reduce the number, you can do that in public school, but there is not any data being collected in childcare to look at this. There needs to be an investment in workforce training and the use of evidence-based practices. When those are put in place, then that would be an alternative strategy and a much better strategy, more effective than any of the exclusionary discipline practices that are being used. Next slide, please. So in the timeline, Head Start in early childhood settings, in 2016, the federal office set a brand new policy for Head Start. It said that we do not want to use suspensions in response to children's behavior, and we would rather use age appropriate and evidence-based practices instead. in 2017, the Texas Department of Family and Protective Services, they go through rule changes as they look through the minimum standards that are set for child care licensing. And when they went through the review last year in 2017, they set a new requirement for child care centers to include in their written operational policies that there must be a policy on suspensions and expulsions. However, what I would like to point out is that DFPS did not state what that policy needs to be. They give guidance and they give encouragement and technical assistance so that the policies would be written to include positive behavior supports and resources and support for teachers and students so that there would not be a reliance on suspensions and expulsions. But it's up to each child care center to create their own policies and have them in there written so that parents can understand what is the policy on discipline at their child's child care center. Next slide, please. This slide is from our very new report that we released that Morgan mentioned on Monday. It's Keeping Kids in Class Pre-K through Second Grade, Suspensions in Texas and a Better Way Forward. What we looked at is the rate of suspensions. So what that looks at is the total number of suspensions, not the total number of students suspended, because you can have students receiving suspensions over and over again, and you would like to capture that. And it's always done as a rate out of 100, whatever population of students that would be. The pre-K through second grade students in public school, if you look at the rates of suspension, this is in-school suspension and out-of-school suspension. The highest rate was for Black children at 20.16, and the second highest was foster children. Children who are in the custody of Texas Department of Family and Protective Services due to abuse and neglect that are in pre-K through second grade had very high rates of in-school and out-of-school suspension. And you can see these compared to the Texas average, which is the overall population of pre-K through second graders in public school at 7.13 out of 100 students. So when you break it down into out-of-school and in-school suspension, what we found is Black children were receiving out-of-school suspension at 5 times the rate of white students. And also, what we found in special education, we requested data to look at. It is disproportionate. There's a high number of students in special education who receive suspensions. But in looking in the categories within special education, the highest category was emotional disturbance. Those students had a rate of 17 times of the Texas average. And the second category in special education was OHI, which stands for Other Health Impairment. And what resides in that category is children who have ADHD, as well as other medical situations in that category, but that does stand out. That was 2 times as often as the Texas average. Also in our report is we went to look for the bill that Morgan mentioned, HB 674. It banned only out-of-school suspensions. And we wanted to look at what, before the ban went into effect, what was it that school districts have been using more often. They use in-school suspension in pre-K through second grade more often than they do out-of-school suspension. So our concern is if we take out of school suspensions off the table, which it should be, will schools be using in-school suspensions at a higher rate because that is what they normally use anyway, at, more often than OSS? And also, you would still be seeing the disparities that we saw even if you took out-of-school suspensions off the table. Those students are still at risk of being suspended due to ISS. Next slide, please. So after seeing this data and understanding that, yes, there is a problem with suspensions, what is it that works? And so here is a list of a few things, and I'll kind of go through some of them a little more in depth, and you may be familiar with these strategies. The first one being social emotional learning, which I'll explain a little bit further. Positive behavioral interventions and supports, or PBIS. That is also one of the things where it has been kind of redesigned to be for preschool, and it's called the pyramid model, and you may have seen that in the past. There's also access to infant early childhood mental health consultants, and then training. Teachers who have had training in implicit bias and trauma-informed care, both of those will be helpful. For training in implicit bias, not only should the training raise awareness, but look at the teacher's understanding of their consequences of their thinking, of their unconscious thoughts, and to be involved in reflective practices about what are their teaching methods and what are the messages that they are sending out. One example was to walk into a classroom and to look at the posters that are in the classroom hanging on the wall. How are girls represented? How are children of color represented? When you're putting posters on the wall, making sure that children who are in the classroom are represented in the posters, and also how are they being shown. And then also looking at trying to make a result in changing the teacher's own thinking and behavior so that as they work with children, they actually change how they act and understand that child to behave. For trauma-informed care, one of the things that was very exciting to me, and I hope maybe you had a chance to see it or can look it up, is Oprah was on the 60 Minutes on March 11th, and she interviewed Dr. Bruce Perry, who is a psychologist and researcher who works on trauma and children's behavior and brain development when they are under trauma and toxic stress. It was quite enlightening, and hopefully will further the conversation about how important that trauma-informed care is in classroom and for teachers to receive training on that. Next slide, please. Thank you. So as an example, we highlighted in our report Houston ISD. If you look at the chart, this is a 10-year look at their in-school and out-of-school suspensions. This is data that we requested from TEA. And as you can see, from the 2013-2014 school year, there has been a marked decrease in school and out-of-school suspensions. And this is not due to the ban as of yet. The ban is currently in effect for this school year. Houston ISD in the 2016-2017 school year, last year, implemented their own ban. And this is a look at their suspension data even before that timeline. They updated their code of conduct. They implemented social emotional learning into their schools. They created an SEL office, and where they have curriculum that is implemented into daily classroom learning. They also implemented Safe and Civil Schools program, and they also put PBIS in 70 schools, and then additional 70 schools during the 2017-2018 school year. So they have been working for the last few years on implementing positive behavior strategies, looking at how to reduce out-of-school suspension even before the ban, and then also looking at their disparities is what they are currently working on, not only to reduce the overall, but to reduce the overall effect on the populations that are disproportionately receiving suspensions. Next slide, please. So one of the questions that I have is to, if you can type them into the chat box, is to find out what positive behavior strategy or training that you attended that was a game changer for your classroom. I was a preschool teacher for 11 years and had gone to all the training that was required in all the different categories by DFPS, but there was one training that I attended that was one of the most influential in my teaching practices, which was applied behavior analysis, to understand the background of children's behavior. So I'm a little curious here as to what has worked for you in your classrooms. I see SEL creating a peace corner. Love peace corners. The pyramid model, wonderful. We'll be talking about that. Conscious discipline. And just be understanding. Absolutely. Loving and kind to children. Developing those relationships that are so important to these little children. Trauma-informed practice. Wonderful. And teaching parents to understand their children's nonverbal communication, absolutely. And learning about the brain of children who have experienced trauma. Absolutely, that's what Dr. Perry is so good at, helping people to understand how that changes the actual physical characters of their children's brains. Really caring and listening, absolutely. So in looking at social emotional learning, there's the universal and program-wide that teaches all students, and then you can bring them into smaller groups or individual SEL instruction depending on their needs. And any of these 5 competencies, if a children is stuck and isn't progressing forward, a small group or one-on-one to help them move forward. So an example of a large social emotional learning program is Austin ISD. They started in the 2011-2012 school year. They put PBIS into every single one of their schools in the entire district. That's 83,000 students at 130 schools. And they have Austin ISD has one of the smallest rates of suspension, especially compared to the 4 districts that we mentioned, Houston, El Paso, Dallas, and Austin, that looked at implementing their own ban and implementing positive behavior strategies. They have a suspension rate of 1 out of 100 compared to the Texas average, which is 7 out of 100. So putting SEL into all of their schools has been an important piece to decreasing their use of suspensions. Next slide, please. And someone had mentioned the pyramid model. So its base is the effective workforce. We need to look at all the systems and policies that promote and sustain the use of evidence-based practices. Good training needs to be available. The blue tier is universal supports, just the importance of relationships in the environment. And there's a study out of Harvard. Harvard has the Center on the Developing Child that every child who winds up doing well has had at least one stable and committed relationship with a supportive adult. And that's what this pyramid model does. And supportive relationships includes not only the relationships with the children, but with the family and with other team members. Suspension and expulsions are reduced and eliminated when there's a supportive relationship between the teacher and the parents. Gilliam's work has brought that information out. And the green tier is for prevention. Students who are identified as needing additional support receive small group or one-on-one. And the red tier is for the small amount of children who need intervention. They help identify students with higher levels of need, being able to convene a team, consult with a behavior specialist or a mental health consultant, and developing a behavior support plan to support those students needing some additional help. Next slide, please. And finally, access to infant early childhood mental health consultation. The infant and early childhood mental health consultation out of the Center of Excellence. If you have not been to that resource, they have a toolbox with so much free information that it was recently released. It has a wealth of information to help you understand the role of the consultant, what they are there to do in the classroom, not only to help the student, the teacher, the families, and overall the program. And as an example, in 2002, the state of Connecticut created a statewide system of mental health consultation. It is called the Early Childhood Consultation Partnership. And what it found was that when they brought consultants into the classroom to work with teachers and parents in the program, and especially for individual students who are at risk of being expelled from the program, after the consultant had worked with everyone, 97% of the children who were at risk of being expelled actually stayed in the program. So it's quite effective into making sure that students are able to be supported and receive what they are needing and not be expelled from their program. And next slide, please. So this is our contact information for Morgan and myself. And feel free to let us know if you have anything after this presentation that we can help with. Otherwise, we have a few minutes, I believe, to open it up for any questions or further clarification on our slides that we can help you with.
Thank you so much, Diane and Morgan, for your presentation. I'm just switching our view right now so that I could see the comments as people are typing in. But I want to put up your contact information again so that hopefully everyone will be able to see it on this slide. And I could see everyone see it. And that may not be possible. Let's see. There it is. Excellent. So we have it up so that everyone's able to see. So Holly is asking if the presentation will be shared in a follow-up email. Absolutely. As soon as we conclude for today, I am going to be sending out an email with the link to your survey where your certificate or CEUs will be attached, and a PDF of the presentation will also be attached. And then it looks like Johanna has a comment, and so Morgan or Diane, I'm going to let you two kind of jump in and address that.
Absolutely. Joanna has a question that teachers don't like the idea to suspend elementary children, but they sometimes don't have enough capacity to help the kids. Any ideas if the school districts are adding any supports, not just on training staff on SEL or PBIS, but adding trained staff to offer support? Yes, actually, depending on the school district, and Joanne, I don't know if maybe after I can find out what school district you work with. The adding of trained staff to offer support would be the behavior specialists. Also, if the child is very young and is in pre-K, that also could qualify to have a mental health consultant come into the classroom. You're with AISD. Wonderful. Thank you. AISD, besides the social emotional learning, there is for each of the tiers, there's a term for it, for each of the feeder patterns, excuse me, that's the correct term. Each of the feeder patterns for the high school down through the middle school, down through the elementary schools, there is a PBIS coordinator for each of those feeder patterns. And in talking to the social and emotional learning office through the district of AISD, those coordinators for SEL should be available to each of the schools, not only for the teachers, but also for any of the individual in the classroom support for PBIS, for SEL. For PBIS, that I believe is due to whether or not your particular school
Awesome. Do we have any
PBIS
other
as a
thoughts
positive
or
behavior
questions?
strategy, and that would fall to the PBIS team,
Thank you
which
guys so much. I know
the
it's 12:54.
behavior
I want to
support
thank all of
specialist who
you
is
for your
within either
patience
the district
as
or the
we
school should be a part of the
tolerated a
PBIS
lot
team.
of technical
Hoping
issues that we navigated today. It was absolutely wonderful hearing from both Morgan and Diane. Morgan, I look forward to, being able to get some of those studies that you talked about and being able to share that with our audience. So I will send out an email following up with this webinar, which will have the link to your survey. It's also going to have a copy of the PowerPoint attached. And then I will send out a separate email once I get the information from Morgan regarding the studies that she cited. And so, because I know there were several of you that were very curious about those studies and some of the information that we learned today. I'm thankful and I'm excited that we're going to be able to take this information and continue to go forward and provide, help and support to infants, toddlers, and children in all of our areas. So thank you, ladies, so much. I really appreciate it. Everyone have a blessed day.